The kitchen still smelled like her. Not Juah, the restaurant. The oil that had soaked into the walls over 3 years. The dried pepper paste she had rubbed into every surface of the prep station like a ritual. The faint sweetness of the palm sugar she imported from a supplier in Accra because nothing Korean came close. The smell was alive even now, even on this last night, even as the last dishwasher pulled off his apron and set it on the counter without a word and walked out the back door without looking at her. Juah stood in the middle of the dining room and did not move. 14 tables. She had chosen every chair herself, had argued with the furniture supplier for 40 minutes over the exact angle of the backrests because she wanted her customers to lean forward slightly, to feel engaged, to feel like the meal in front of them deserved their full attention. The chairs were still perfectly arranged. The tables still had the small clay centerpieces she had brought back from Monrovia on her last visit home. Small fired earth bowls glazed in rust and amber that caught candlelight in a way nothing ceramic could replicate. Nobody was sitting in any of them. The reservation book on the host stand was open to tonight's date. 12 bookings. 3 had shown. 1 had sent back the soup without explanation. The other 2 had eaten quietly and left without making eye contact on their way out, as if the failure of the place was something they could catch. Juah picked up the reservation book and looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it back down. She had known for 6 weeks. The supplier, a man named Bae Cheol-soo who had come to her highly recommended, who had shaken her hand with both of his and called her business an inspiration, had been selling her compromised stock. Shellfish held 2 days past safe temperature. Greens treated with something she still could not identify. She had not known. She had trusted him because she had no reason not to, because she was already stretched thin managing the kitchen and the books and the staffing alone, because she was a Liberian woman running a restaurant in Busan without a single family member within 4,000 miles, and trust was sometimes the only currency she had left. Then 4 customers got sick on the same Tuesday in March. Welcome back to Afrokorean Storyhouse channel. Before we continue with this story, tell us in the comments section where you are watching from. And if you are new here, hit the like and subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on your notification to get notified whenever we drop a video. By Wednesday morning, the food blog posts had started. By Thursday, a local news outlet had picked it up. By Friday, her phone had stopped ringing with reservations and started ringing with cancellations. Bae Cheol-soo had not answered a single one of her calls after that Thursday. His business address turned out to be a mail forwarding service. His recommendation had come from a man she had met once at a culinary networking event and never seen again. She had reported it, filed everything. The investigation was ongoing, which in practice meant it was going nowhere. The restaurant had lasted another 6 weeks on savings and stubbornness. Tonight was the last night because the landlord needed an answer by morning, and she did not have one to give him that was worth anything. Juah walked to the kitchen one more time. She stood at her station, the one she had worked every service, the one where she had developed the pepperdounjang braise that a food writer had once called the most interesting thing happening in Busan's dining scene, and she put both hands flat on the steel surface and felt how cold it was. She did not cry. She had already cried. There was nothing left in that direction. She turned off the last light and walked out. Master Han died 11 days later. She found out the way she found out most things now, late and alone. A former colleague sent her a message on a Tuesday morning while she was sitting in a convenience store eating rice from a plastic container because her gas had been cut off and she could not cook at home. The message was brief. Just a name, a date, and a single line. "I thought you should know." Juah set down the rice. She had studied under Master Han for 2 years before she opened the restaurant. He had not been easy. He was precise to the point of coldness. He did not give compliments freely, and he had a habit of standing directly behind her while she worked that she had never fully adjusted to. But he had also been the first person in Korea who had looked at what she could do in a kitchen and not immediately tried to redirect it into something more familiar. He had tasted her pepperdounjang braise when it was still rough and unfinished and said, without ceremony, "Keep going." 2 words. She had kept going for 3 years on the strength of them. She had not spoken to him in 8 months. After the restaurant collapsed, she had not been able to make herself call him. She did not know how to explain what had happened without it sounding like failure, and failure in front of Master Han felt like a specific kind of shame she was not ready to carry. Now he was gone and she had lost the chance to try. She sat in the convenience store for a long time after that. The rice went cold. Outside, Busan went about its business. The street noise, the delivery bikes, the overlapping conversations of people who had somewhere to be. Juah watched through the glass and felt the particular loneliness of being a person who has lost two things at once and is not sure which one to grieve first. The lawyer's office was on the fourth floor of a building near Siamayan that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The lawyer himself was a small man named Choi who wore his suit like it belonged to someone slightly larger and who looked at Juah for a long moment before consulting his documents, as if confirming she was who she claimed to be. "You are Juah," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. Master Han Sungwon listed you as sole beneficiary for the collection." He slid a document across the desk. 41 handwritten recipe books. They are currently in storage at his former residence in Namcheondong. You can arrange collection at your convenience. Juah looked at the document without picking it up. "Just the books. Just the books." Choi folded his hands. "The property and financial assets go to his family. The books he specified separately, by name with a note." He found a smaller envelope and pushed it across. This was attached to the bequest. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card in Master Han's handwriting, small, precise, slightly right-leaning, the kind of handwriting that looked like it had been trained rather than developed. It said, "You were always the one who paid attention. Now pay attention to these." Juah read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. She collected the books on a Thursday, carrying them up the 4 flights to her apartment in 3 trips because she could not afford to hire anyone and the elevator in her building had been broken for 2 months. 41 books. Each one a different size, some thick and swollen with use, some slim and barely touched. All of them bound in the same dark cloth cover with a small label on the spine in Master Han's handwriting identifying the contents, Broths and Foundations, Volume 1. Fermentation Studies. Cold Preparations. She stacked them along the wall of her main room and stood back and looked at them. For the first 3 days, she did not open a single one. She was not ready. The books felt like a conversation she needed to work up to, like calling someone after too long and not knowing how to begin. On the 4th night, she could not sleep. The apartment was too quiet and the street outside was too loud in the specific way Busan streets are loud at 2 in the morning. Not busy, just restless. And she lay on her back staring at the ceiling until she gave up and got up and went to the wall and pulled out the first book her hand found. Fermentation Studies. She sat cross-legged on the floor under the single lamp she had positioned near the wall and opened it. Master Han's handwriting filled every page. Recipe after recipe, dense with instruction, the kind of notes that were clearly written for himself rather than for teaching shorthand she sometimes recognized from her time studying under him and sometimes did not, references to techniques by names he had apparently invented, margin annotations in even smaller script that commented on previous entries with the critical detachment of a man reviewing his own work across decades. It was extraordinary. Even just flipping through it, she could feel the weight of what he had built over a lifetime, the accumulation of knowledge, the obsessive refinement, the way a single ingredient might appear in 20 different contexts across 20 different pages as he worked out every possible expression of it. She read for 2 hours without stopping. Then she turned to a page near the middle of the book and stopped. The recipe was for a fermented pepper paste. Simple enough, the ingredients were listed in the standard order, the method was laid out in his usual precise shorthand. She read through it once and then read through it again because something had snagged her attention and she was not yet sure what it was. She read it a 3rd time. The measurement was wrong. Not wrong in the way a typo is wrong or wrong in the way an early draft is wrong. Wrong in a way that made no sense from a man who had spent 40 years perfecting fermentation ratios. The recipe called for 4 times the salt that the method could absorb without destroying the paste entirely. It was not a rounding error. It was not ambiguous. It was simply, flatly, impossibly wrong, and Master Han did not make mistakes like that. Not in his personal books. Not in work he had been refining for decades. Juah sat very still. She turned back 3 pages. Read the previous recipe. Then forward 4 pages. Read the one that followed. She set the book down on her knee and stared at the wall. Her mind was moving slowly and quickly at the same time, the way it moved when she was in the middle of a difficult service and something had gone wrong and she needed to stay calm while also processing very fast. She had learned to trust that feeling. It usually meant she was right about something she had not yet fully articulated. She picked the book back up and turned to the beginning and started again. This time she was not reading for the recipes. She was reading for the mistakes. There were 9 of them in fermentation studies alone. Not scattered randomly. That was the first thing she noticed once she began marking them. They followed a pattern. Every third recipe contained an error, and the errors were always in the same position within the recipe. The second measurement in the ingredient list. Never the first, never the third. Always the second. She wrote the incorrect measurements down on a piece of paper in the order they appeared. For X, 2X, 0, 4X, 2X, 7X, 1X, 9X, 2X. She looked at the sequence for a long time. Then she pulled out a second book. Cold Preparations. Opened it and began reading with the same focused attention, looking for the same pattern. She found it on the second page. By 4 in the morning she had gone through 6 books and filled both sides of 3 sheets of paper with numbers. Her tea had gone cold. The lamp was making a faint buzzing noise she had never noticed before. Outside, the restless Busan street had finally gone quiet. Juah sat in the middle of her apartment floor surrounded by 41 books and 6 pages of numbers and felt something she had not felt in months. She felt awake. She pulled the index card from her pocket and read it again. You were always the one who paid attention. Now pay attention to these. All right? She said quietly to the empty room. All right, Master Han. She picked up the next book and kept going. By the end of the first week she had a system. She worked at night because the days were for survival. The part-time dishwashing shift she had picked up at a restaurant 3 streets over that paid enough to cover food and electricity and nothing else. The kind of work she did with her head down and her hands moving and her mind somewhere else entirely. The owner was a heavy-set man named Gwon who had hired her without asking many questions and who had the decency to pretend he did not recognize her name, though she had seen the flicker of recognition cross his face during the interview and had watched him decide to be kind about it. She was grateful for that. Gratitude was cheap and she had plenty of it these days. At night she came home, changed out of her work clothes, made tea, and sat on the floor with the books. The system worked like this. She read each book cover to cover first, marking every error she found with a small pencil in the margin. Nothing that would damage the text, nothing irreversible, just a dot that told her eyes where to return. Then she went back through and extracted the second measurement from every marked recipe and wrote it in sequence on her running sheets. Then she looked at what the sequence produced. Most of it she could not yet read. The numbers resolved into patterns she could feel the edge of but not yet see clearly, the way a word in a language you are learning will sit just outside recognition before suddenly becoming obvious. She was not frustrated by this. Frustration was for people who had somewhere else to be. Juah had nowhere else to be. What she could read were the dates. She found the first one in Broths and Foundations, Volume 2, a sequence of measurements that, when she converted them using the substitution logic she had begun to develop from the first 6 books, produced not a ratio but a number that was clearly a year. She stared at it for a long time before she accepted what she was seeing. Then she went back through her earlier sheets and looked for the same conversion pattern applied to sequences she had dismissed as unresolved. 3 of them were also years. She wrote them in a column on a fresh sheet of paper. She looked at the column and felt the story beginning to take shape the way a broth takes shape. Slowly, invisibly, until suddenly the surface clears and you can see straight to the bottom. On the 9th night, she found the first name. It was buried in Preservation Techniques, a slim book she had initially moved to the back of her reading order because its contents seemed the most technical and the least likely to yield anything useful. She had been wrong about that. The name appeared in a sequence that she almost missed because it was encoded differently from the numbers, not in measurements but in the first letters of each ingredient listed in a particular recipe, read not left to right but top to bottom. She had been staring at the ingredient list for 20 minutes, feeling the familiar edge of recognition sensation, when she tried the vertical red almost as an afterthought. The letters spelled Park Jin-ho. Juah set the book down very carefully on the floor in front of her. Park Jin-ho. She did not know the name yet, but the encoding was deliberate. She was certain of that now, with a certainty that had moved beyond theory into something physical, something she felt in her sternum. Master Han had not been careless. Master Han had not been senile. Master Han had spent years, possibly decades, building something inside these books that he had never been able to say out loud, and he had left them to the one person he trusted to find it. She pulled her laptop toward her and typed the name. The search returned immediately. Park Jin-ho, founder of the Chongwon Empire. Born 1951, died 2019. A profile piece from a Korean business magazine described him as one of the most consequential figures in the history of Korean fine dining. A man who had built a restaurant group that now operated 37 locations across South Korea and had recently expanded into Singapore and Tokyo. The article included a photograph. A heavy-set man in his 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular expression of someone who had been photographed many times and had long since stopped performing for cameras. Juah looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the dates she had extracted. She went back to the search and typed, Chongwon Empire Founding History. The first result told her the empire had been established in 1988. She sat back. 1 year after the first date in Master Han's books. She found the second name 4 nights later, in Sauce Architecture, Volume 3. This time the encoding was different again. Not vertical letters, but the first syllable of every third instruction step, read in sequence. She had been refining her understanding of Master Han's system with every book, learning the grammar of it the way you learn a person's speech patterns after enough time in their company. He varied the method deliberately, she had realized, never the same encoding twice in the same book, always shifting the cipher just enough that you could not simply apply the same key and walk through. You had to read him. You had to know how he thought. She knew how he thought. That was why he had left these to her. The second name was Yonsangchul. She searched it. Yoon Sang-chul, former business partner of Park Jin-ho, listed in several early articles about the Chongwon Empire's founding years as a co-investor who had exited the partnership in 1992. One article mentioned the exit had been contentious. No further detail. After 1992, his name appeared almost nowhere. Juah wrote his name under Park Jin-ho's on her sheet and drew a line between them. Then she went back to the books and kept reading. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while she was on her dishwashing shift. She did not recognize the number. She let it go to voicemail and checked the message during her break. Standing in the narrow alley behind the restaurant with her back against the damp wall and the Busan afternoon gray and clothes above her. The voice was male, measured, with the particular flatness of someone choosing their words with extreme care. Miss Juah, my name is not important at this stage. What is important is that you have something that does not belong to you. Master Han's estate was handled incorrectly. The recipe books should not have been released to a private individual. We are prepared to resolve this quietly and generously. Please call this number. The message ended. Juah played it again. Then a third time. She stood in the alley for a long moment, listening to the city. A delivery bike went past the end of the alley. Somewhere above her a window opened and a woman called out something to someone Juah could not see. She deleted the message and went back inside. That night she worked faster. Not carelessly. She was never careless with the books. But the call had clarified something she had been approaching slowly and was now ready to accept. She was not solving an academic puzzle. Someone knew what was in these books, or suspected it, and they wanted the books back before she could finish reading them. That meant the clock was running. That meant she needed to move. She pulled Grain Studies from the stack, a book she had been saving because its encoding felt the most complex of the ones she had sampled, and opened it. 3 hours in she found something that was not a name and not a date. It was a location. The encoding was the most elaborate she had encountered. A combination of vertical letter extraction and a measurement substitution she had to work through 3 times before she trusted her own result. But when she had it, it was clear. Not a street address but a place name specific enough to be useful. Liberia. And beneath it, in the same encoding, extracted from the following recipe. Barnga. 1987. Juah's hand stopped moving on the paper. Barnga. A city in Bong County in the interior of Liberia. Not a place that appeared in Korean culinary history. Not a place that had any obvious connection to fine dining in Busan or Seoul or anywhere in the Chongwon Empire story. Except that Juah knew Barnga. Her grandmother had grown up there. Mama Fatu had cooked in Barnga for the first 30 years of her life before moving south to Monrovia. She still talked about the markets there, the specific quality of the peppers from the farms on the edge of the city, the way the cassava grew differently in that soil. Juah looked at the word on her paper and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite understanding, not yet, but the immediate precursor to it. The feeling of a key finding its lock. Barnga, Park Jin-ho. She picked up her phone and pulled up the business magazine profile of Park Jin-ho again. Scrolled past the founding of the empire, past the expansion years, looking for anything about his early career, his training, his life before Chongwon. Near the bottom of the article, in a paragraph about his culinary influences, a single line. Park has spoken occasionally about a formative period of travel in West Africa in the mid-1980s, which he credits with expanding his understanding of fermentation and spice layering. Juah read the line twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at the wall. West Africa, mid-1980s, fermentation and spice layering. She thought about Mama Fatu in her kitchen in Monrovia, the fermented pepper paste she made every season that she had learned from her own mother and her mother before that. A recipe so specific to her family that Juah had never tasted anything remotely like it anywhere else in the world. Not in Liberia, not in Korea, not in the 3 years she had spent building a restaurant around the flavors she carried in her memory. Not anywhere. Except, she realized now, in Fermentation Studies, Volume 1. The book she had opened first. The book with the impossible salt measurement that had started all of this. She got up and found the book and turned to that first recipe and read it again. Really read it this time, not for the code, not for the error, but for the recipe itself. The base was a red pepper fermented with a specific combination of local greens and a particular ratio of palm oil that she had never seen in any Korean fermentation recipe. The flavor profile, described in Master Han's precise shorthand, moved through heat and sweetness and a deep savory back note that he had annotated in the margin with a single word, irreplaceable. Juah sat with the book in her lap for a long time. The pepper paste in this recipe was not Master Han's. She knew that now. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. She had grown up watching that paste being made, had learned the movement of it before she could read, had carried the smell of it across an ocean in the part of her memory that never fully translated into words. This was Mama Fatu's recipe, and it was sitting in the middle of a dead Korean chef's private collection, attributed to no one, labeled with nothing, surrounded by 40 years of work that had made him one of the most celebrated culinary figures in South Korea. Juah closed the book very slowly. Outside, Busan had gone quiet again. The lamp buzzed. Her tea was cold. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back down. Not yet. She needed more before she called home. She needed to understand the full shape of what had been taken before she asked Mama Fatu to remember what it had cost her. She reached for the next book. The third name appeared 2 nights later. Vegetable Studies, Volume 2. The encoding was vertical again, but with a new variation. Every second letter of the extracted sequence was reversed, so that the first pass-through produced nonsense and only the corrected read resolved into something legible. It took her 4 attempts before she trusted the result. The name was Masterhan. Juah looked at it for a long moment. She had been expecting this. Had felt it coming the way you feel weather changing. Not a surprise exactly, but still an impact when it arrives. Master Han had not left his own name out of the confession. He had encoded himself alongside the others. He was not writing as a witness. He was writing as a participant. She turned to the next marked recipe in the book and extracted the sequence beneath his name. What she found was not a date or a location. It was a role. The encoding produced 2 syllables that she sat with for a long time before she accepted their meaning. She had to look up the term to be certain. It was an older business term, slightly formal, the kind of language a man of Master Han's generation would have used. It meant intermediary. Master Han had been the one who went to Liberia. Not Park Jin-ho directly, Master Han. He had been the one who traveled to Barnga in 1987, who had sat in a kitchen with a woman whose name was not yet in any of the books but whose hands had built something extraordinary, who had watched and learned and written it all down and brought it back and handed it to the man who turned it into an empire. and then said nothing for 30 years. Juah sat on the floor of her apartment and let the full weight of it settle onto her. Master Han had taught her everything she knew about cooking. He had stood behind her at her station and watched her hands and told her to keep going. He had seen a Liberian woman in a Korean kitchen and decided she was worth his time and his attention and his 2 words of encouragement that had carried her for 3 years. And he had built his entire reputation on the stolen foundation of another Liberian woman's life's work. Juah did not cry. She sat very still and breathed carefully and let the feeling move through her without fighting it. Anger and grief and something that was not quite either of those. A particular kind of hurt that comes from discovering that the person you thought believed in you was also capable of a betrayal you can barely hold in your mind. Then she reached for the next book. Because there was still more. She could feel it. The books were not finished with her yet. The 4th name took her the longest to find. Not because the encoding was more complex. By now she had mapped enough of Master Han's system that she moved through most books within a single sitting. It took long because the name was not in the books she had been reading. It was in the one book she had opened first, set aside, and not returned to since that initial night. Fermentation Studies, Volume 1. The book that had started everything. She had assumed she had extracted everything useful from it in those first frantic hours. She had been wrong. She found it on a Tuesday night 3 weeks into her reading, when something pulled her back to the beginning the way unresolved things always pull you back. A feeling of incompleteness, like a sentence that has a subject and a verb but no object. She opened Fermentation Studies, Volume I again and started from the first page. She found the name on page 7. Hidden not in the measurements and not in the vertical letter extraction but in the recipe titles themselves, the first letter of every title across 7 consecutive recipes. Read in sequence. F, A, T, U, K, A, M. Juah stopped breathing for a moment. She wrote it out. Fatukam, Fatu Kam. Not Mama Fatu's full name. Her grandmother had married into the name Kamara, shortened in family used to Kam. Fatu Kam was what the older generation in Barnga had called her before she moved south. It was a name Juah had heard only a handful of times in her life, always from her grandmother's oldest friends, always with the particular warmth people use for a name that carries history. Master Han had known her grandmother's name. He had encoded it in the first book. The one he had placed at the front of the collection. The one that contained the recipe that had started Juah's unraveling of the whole system. He had not buried Mama Fatu. He had put her at the beginning. Juah sat with that for a long time. There was something in it that she could not yet decide how to feel about. It was not absolution. Nothing in these books absolved Master Han of what he had done. But it was something. He had known the name of the woman at the foundation of everything. He had remembered her. He had placed her first. Whatever that meant, whatever it was worth, it was not nothing. She wrote Mama Fatu's name at the top of her master sheet, above all the others, and drew a line down from it to everything that followed. On a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the phone call she had deleted, a man was waiting outside her building. She saw him before he saw her. She had developed that habit years ago, the particular alertness of a woman who lived alone in a city that was not her own, the way her eyes moved to entrances and exits automatically, the way she clocked strangers in her periphery without making it visible. He was standing near the building door with the practiced casualness of someone trying not to look like they were waiting, which meant he was absolutely waiting. He was in his 40s, well-dressed without being formal, with the particular physical stillness of a man accustomed to being patient. He saw her when she was 6 steps away and did not pretend otherwise. "Miss Juah." She kept walking at the same pace. "I don't know you." "No." He fell into step beside her, which she did not like. "My employer would like to speak with you." "Your employer can call like a normal person." He did. "You deleted the message." She stopped at the building door and turned to face him fully. Up close he had the look of someone who had spent a long career managing problems quietly, not threatening exactly, but with a competence that was its own kind of pressure. "I deleted it because it was not a reasonable message," she said. "It claimed I was in possession of something that didn't belong to me. Those books were left to me legally by name with documentation. So whoever your employer is, He already knows that, which means the message was not really about legality. It was about something else. The man looked at her for a moment. My employer is Park Sung-jin. Juah kept her face still. I know who that is. Then you understand the sensitivity of the situation. What I understand, she said, is that a man I have never met is sending intermediaries to my home address to retrieve books that belong to me. That's not sensitivity. That's pressure. She took out her keys. Tell Park Sung-jin that if he wants to have a conversation, he can find a legal and civil way to request one. Until then, we have nothing to discuss. She went inside and did not look back. She climbed the 4 flights slowly, her hands steady on the railing, her mind running fast and clean beneath the surface calm. Park Sung-jin knew about the books. That was not a surprise. He was the heir to an empire that may have had decades of reason to monitor Master Han. What it told her was that the timeline was shorter than she had been treating it. She had been reading with the patience of someone solving a puzzle for its own sake. She needed to read now with the urgency of someone who understood that the puzzle had an audience. She went inside, made tea, and opened the next book. Cold Preparations, Volume 2 was where she found the transaction. She had been looking for it without knowing she was looking for it. Some record of the actual exchange, the moment when what had been taken became formally invisible. The books had given her names, dates, a location, a role. What they had not yet given her was the mechanism. How had a Liberian woman's lifetime of culinary knowledge been absorbed into a Korean fine dining empire without leaving a public trace? The answer was in the measurements. The encoding in this book was the most intricate she had encountered. A layered system that required her to apply 2 separate keys in sequence, the first extracting a set of numbers and the second converting those numbers using a substitution table she found embedded in the book's index, hidden in the page numbers of recipes that did not exist. She spent 3 nights on it. On the 3rd night, it resolved. What it produced was not a narrative. Master Han was not a storyteller. He was a cook and a record keeper, and what he had built inside these books was a record, precise and cold and complete. The transaction had occurred in 1987 in Barnga. Master Han had traveled there under the cover of a culinary research project. A legitimate enough framing that it had appeared in at least one academic publication she subsequently found, a short paper on West African fermentation practices co-authored by Master Han and a Korean university professor, published in 1989 and cited almost nowhere. The paper had drawn on fieldwork conducted in Liberia. The fieldwork had been conducted in Mama Fatu's kitchen. Mama Fatu had not been credited in the paper. She had been referenced as a local practitioner whose traditional methods had provided observational data. No name, no location specific enough to trace. Just an anonymous woman in an anonymous kitchen whose life's work had been classified as raw material. From that fieldwork, Master Han had brought back detailed notes, measurements, techniques, flavor profiles, the specific combinations that made Mama Fatu's fermentation practice distinct from anything else in the region. He had brought them to Park Jin-ho. Park Jin-ho had built Chongwon's foundational menu around them. The restaurant had opened in 1988. By 1991, it had its first major critical recognition. By 1994, it was the most celebrated fine dining establishment in Seoul. The dates matched. All of them. Juah sat back and looked at what she had assembled across weeks of nights on her apartment floor. A line from a woman in Barnga in 1987 to a restaurant empire in Seoul that was currently valued, according to the most recent business report she could find, at several hundred billion won. Mama Fatu had never seen a single one of it, had never been asked, had probably never known. She called home on a Sunday morning. Not because she was ready, because she had been delaying it and she knew why she was delaying it, and the reason was not good enough anymore. She was afraid of what she would hear in her grandmother's voice. She was afraid that the call would make it real in a way that 41 books and weeks of night reading had not yet made it real. She called anyway. Mama Fatu picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was the same as it always was, deep and slightly rough, carrying the particular warmth of someone for whom hospitality is not a performance but a reflex. Juah, it is early for you to be calling. I know, Mama Fatu. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. I was awake. I am always awake. A pause and the sound of movement. her grandmother shifting in her chair, the specific creak that Juah had been hearing on phone calls since she was a child. You sound like something is sitting on you. Something is. Juah looked at the sheet of paper in front of her. Mama Fatu's name at the top, the long line of everything that followed. I want to ask you something and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to understand exactly what you remember. Silence on the line. Then, ask. In 1987, did anyone come to your kitchen in Barnga? Korean man. He might have said he was doing research. He might have spent several days watching you cook, asking questions about your fermentation process, your pepper paste, your methods. The silence that followed was longer than any silence Mama Fatu had ever given her on a phone call. Juah counted 7 seconds. Yes, her grandmother said finally. Her voice had changed, not cold, but careful. The voice of someone who has kept a door closed for a long time and is now feeling someone's hand on the other side of it. There were 2 of them. One spoke a little French. The other one mostly watched and wrote things down. Juah closed her eyes. The one who wrote things down, she said. Do you remember what he looked like? Old now. Dead probably. A short pause. Thin man. Very precise. He had a way of standing that made you feel he was memorizing you. Master Han. She had described Master Han exactly. The way he stood behind his students at their stations, the quality of his attention. Mama Fatu, Juah said carefully. Did they pay you for your time? Another long silence. They brought a gift, her grandmother said at last. Food. Wine. They were polite. I fed them because that is what you do when people come to your kitchen. Her voice shifted. Something under it now, old and tired and precise. I knew when they left that something had passed between us that was not equal. I could not have told you then what it was. I was younger. I did not have the words for it. A pause. I have the words for it now. Juah pressed her hand flat on the paper in front of her. I know what they took, Mama Fatu. I can prove it. I have the proof in my apartment right now. Silence. Juah. Her grandmother's voice was very quiet. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet, Juah said honestly. But I am not going to do nothing. Another silence. Then Mama Fatu made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something older than a laugh. Something that had been waiting a long time to be released. No, she said. You never do nothing. That is why I always worried about you. 2 days after the call, Park Sung-jin's man came back. This time he did not wait outside. He was sitting in the convenience store on Juah Street when she came in after her shift. Same table, same careful stillness, a cup of coffee in front of him that he was not drinking. Juah bought her rice and sat down across from him without being asked. You came back, she said. My employer is prepared to be generous, he said. He understands the books have sentimental value. He is prepared to compensate you appropriately. How much? He named a figure. It was a lot of money. It was, in fact, more money than her restaurant had turned over in its best quarter. It was the kind of number that was designed to end conversations, to make the person across from you feel that refusing it would be irrational. Juah ate a spoonful of rice. No. The man's expression did not change. Miss Juah, I want you to understand something, she said, setting down her spoon. That number tells me exactly how much those books are worth to Park Sung-jin. And that means I now know that what is inside them is worth considerably more. To him, specifically. She picked up her spoon again. So no. And please tell him that sending you back a 3rd time will be taken as a form of harassment, and I will respond to it accordingly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, left the coffee untouched, and walked out. Juah finished her rice. She was not calm. Under the surface she was running very fast, calculating distances and timelines, thinking about what she had and what she still needed and how long she had before the pressure from Park Sung-jin moved from financial to something else. She did not underestimate him. A man whose family had spent 30 years protecting a secret worth hundreds of billions of won did not stay polite indefinitely. She needed to finish reading the books. She went home and worked through the night. She finished the last book on a Thursday night. 41 books. 7 weeks of nights. Hundreds of extracted sequences. corrected reads, resolved encodings. Her master sheet had grown to 11 pages, filled on both sides in her own handwriting. Smaller and smaller as the weeks progressed, as if she had been unconsciously trying to fit everything into the space available before it ran out. She sat on the floor with the last book closed in her lap and looked at what she had built. The full picture was this. In 1987, Master Han had traveled to Liberia with a Korean academic named Professor Wu, the co-author of the 1989 paper, under the funding of a culinary research grant administered by a foundation that, when Juah traced it through 3 layers of corporate records online, turned out to have been established by Park Jin-ho 2 years earlier. The trip had been designed from the beginning. It was not opportunistic research that happened to produce useful material. It was a targeted acquisition dressed as scholarship. They had spent 11 days in Barnga, 11 days in Mama Fatu's kitchen. Master Han had documented everything, not just the recipes but the techniques, the seasonal variations, the specific sourcing of ingredients, the logic of flavor combinations that Mama Fatu had developed over 30 years of cooking. He had been thorough in the way that only a man with a clear purpose can be thorough. He had taken everything. He had brought it back to Park Jin-ho. Park Jin-ho had spent a year integrating it into the foundational menu of what would become Chongwon. The empire had opened in 1988 and the critics had responded to something they called impossible to define. A quality in the fermentation, a depth in the spice work, a kind of flavor memory that felt ancient and irreducible and entirely original. It was original. It was just not Park Jin-ho's. Yoon Sang-chul, the co-investor whose name she had found early in her reading, had been the one who raised the question. Not out of conscience, the records suggested nothing so clean. He had wanted a larger share of the growing empire and had used his knowledge of the Liberia trip as leverage. The dates told the story. The dispute had begun in 1990, escalated through 1991, and ended with Yoon Sang-chul's exit from the partnership in 1992, accompanied by a settlement figure that Master Han had encoded in sauce architecture. Volume I with the precise bitterness of a man who had watched money move around a secret he was complicit in. Yoon Sang-chul had taken the money and disappeared from the public record. Park Jin-ho had continued building. Master Han had continued cooking, continued teaching, continued accumulating the kind of respected legacy that a man earns when he is very good at his work and very careful about what he says in public. And then, at some point, she could not pinpoint exactly when, though the encoding in the later books had a different quality from the earlier ones, more urgent, less controlled, Master Han had started writing it down. Why he had not gone to anyone while he was alive was something the books did not fully answer. She had thought about it for weeks and had arrived at the only explanation that fit the man she had known. He was afraid and he was ashamed, and those 2 things had held him in place for long enough that going forward became impossible, and the only thing left was to leave the truth to someone else to carry. Someone he trusted to carry it without flinching. He had chosen her. She was not sure whether to be honored or furious. Most nights she was both. She requested a meeting with Park Sung-jin through formal channels. A letter sent to the Chongwon corporate address, typed and printed and sent by registered mail, requesting a private meeting at a time of his convenience to discuss matters related to the estate of Han Sung-won. No specifics, no threats, just the letter, signed with her full name. She expected to wait. She had prepared herself to wait, had mapped out the next 2 weeks with the assumption that he would either ignore the letter or respond through a lawyer with language designed to extend the timeline indefinitely. He called her directly 4 days later. His voice was not what she had expected. She had been building a version of Park Sung-jin in her mind across 7 weeks of reading about his family's history, and it had produced a voice to match, cold, measured, the voice of inherited power. What she got was younger sounding than she had anticipated and slightly too controlled, like someone who had rehearsed neutral. Miss Juah, I received your letter. I know. Thank you for calling. I understand you have some materials that belong to Master Han. A pause. I also understand my representative has spoken to you on 2 occasions about this matter. He has. I would have preferred a more direct approach from the beginning. Another pause, and she could hear something in it. Not quite an apology, but the shape of one. I am prepared to meet with you. I have time on Friday afternoon. Friday works. He gave her an address, not the Chongwon corporate offices, which told her something. A private address in Houndy, the kind of neighborhood where conversations happened in rooms with good soundproofing and no paper trail. "I will see you Friday," she said. She ended the call and stood for a moment in the middle of her apartment. The 11 pages of notes on the floor around her, the 41 books stacked against the wall. She had 4 days. She spent them preparing. She did not bring all 11 pages. She brought 3, selected and ordered with the same care she used to build a tasting menu, each piece chosen for its specific weight and placed in a sequence designed to produce a particular effect. She also brought 4 of the books themselves, flagged with the small pieces of paper she had been using as markers, open to the pages that mattered most. And she brought one other thing, the item she had found in the final book, the one she had saved until last, the one that had taken her the longest single session to decode and that had made her sit very still on her apartment floor for a long time after she understood what she was looking at. She had placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and put it in the bag with everything else. The address in Houndy was a residential building, modern, expensive, the kind of place that had a concierge who called up before allowing visitors through. The concierge called up. She was allowed through. The elevator was silent and fast and opened directly into a private floor. Park Sung-jin was waiting in a room that was designed to communicate ease, low furniture, natural light, the kind of considered interior that cost a great deal of money to make look unconsidered. He was younger than his father had been in the photographs she had studied, early 40s, with the same close-cropped hair and a face that was doing the work of appearing relaxed. He stood when she came in and gestured to the seating across from him. "Miss Juah, please." She sat. He sat. A woman appeared briefly with tea and disappeared. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I appreciate you meeting me directly." She set her bag on the cushion beside her. "I'll be straightforward with you. I've spent the last 7 weeks reading Master Han's recipe books very carefully. All 41 of them." Something moved across his face. Fast, controlled, gone almost before it was visible. They were his private journals. "I'm not sure." "He left them to me," she said, "with a note asking me to pay attention to them. I paid attention." Silence. "What do you think you found?" he said. His voice had flattened slightly. Not aggressive, but the rehearsed neutrality was thinner now. "I don't think," Juah said. "I know." She opened the bag and took out the first of the 3 pages. Set it on the table between them. Master Han encoded records inside the recipe books over what appears to be several decades. Names, dates, locations, transactions. "I have extracted and documented all of it." She tapped the page. "This is a timeline. It starts in 1987 in Barnga, Liberia, and it ends with the founding and rise of the Chongwon Empire." Park Sung-jin looked at the page. He did not pick it up. "That is a significant claim. It is an accurate claim." She took out the second page. "These are the names Master Han encoded in the books. Your father's name, Yoon Sang-chul's name, Master Han's own name with the role he assigned to himself. And one more name." She set the second page down. "Fatu Kamara, my grandmother, currently alive in Monrovia, Liberia, 73 years old, still cooking." The room was very quiet. "I spoke to her 3 weeks ago," Juah continued. "She remembers the visit. She remembers 2 men coming to her kitchen in Barnga in 1987. She remembers feeding them. She remembers knowing, when they left, that something had passed between them that was not equal." Juah looked at him steadily. "She has the words for it now." Park Sung-jin sat very still. His hands were flat on his thighs. His face had moved through several expressions she could not fully catalog. Something that might have been shock, something that might have been calculation, and something beneath both of those that she was not yet ready to name. "Miss Juah," he said, and his voice was careful the way ice is careful. Smooth on the surface, uncertain underneath. "I have to be honest with you. What you are describing. I have no knowledge of any of this. My father built this company. I inherited it. Whatever occurred in the early years of this business." "Your father's signature," Juah said. He stopped. She reached into the bag and took out the envelope. Set it on the table. Did not open it yet. "In the final book," she said, "Master Han encoded a document reference. A receipt of exchange, dated 1988, signed by your father and by Master Han, acknowledging the transfer of culinary documentation from the Liberia fieldwork to the Chongwon founding team. Master Han reproduced it inside the encoding. I have the full text. She put her hand on the envelope. Your father's signature is in there, in his own hand, because Master Han encoded it character by character. She paused. He was meticulous. He was always meticulous. The silence in the room was a different quality now. Heavier. The kind of silence that forms when a denial has found the wall behind it and has nowhere left to go. Park Sung-jin looked at the envelope for a long moment. You could be fabricating this, he said, but the flatness in his voice told her he did not believe what he was saying. I could be, Juah said evenly, but you don't think I am. And we both know that if I were going to fabricate something, I would not have requested a private meeting. I would have gone to a journalist. He looked at her. Something in his face had given way, not dramatically, not with any of the visible collapse she might have imagined in the weeks of building toward this moment. It was smaller than that, a tightening around the eyes, a slight forward lean that he corrected almost immediately. The physical signature of a man who has been carrying a weight he pretended was not there and has just felt it shift. What do you want? He said. I want you to listen, Juah said. Not to negotiate, not to plan your response, just to listen. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She opened the envelope. She read it to him from the beginning, not just the document, everything, the timeline, the names, the transaction, the paper that had buried her grandmother as a local practitioner. She read it in the same voice she used in a kitchen when something had gone wrong, and she needed everyone around her to understand the full scope of the problem before they could begin to address it. Clear, unhurried, without drama. The drama was already in the facts. It did not need her to perform it. Park Sung-jin did not interrupt. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his face moving through things he was not saying, and she watched him the way she had learned to watch people who were processing information that reorganized something fundamental. Not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, but with the careful attention of someone who needed to know where he was going to land before she said the last thing she had to say. When she finished reading, she set the papers down and waited. The silence lasted a long time. He never told me, Park Sung-jin said finally. His voice had changed, the control was still there, but underneath it something had cracked open. My father. He never said a word about Liberia, about any of this. I know. The foundation of everything we built. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I have spent my entire adult life growing something I believed was legitimate. I restructured the board. I brought in ethical sourcing standards. He stopped again. I believe you, Juah said. And she did. His shock was real. She had been watching for performance, and this was not performance. This was a man discovering that the ground under 30 years of his life was not what he had been told. What happens now? He said. That depends on you, Juah said. I am not going to tell you what to do with what you have just learned. That is not my decision. She looked at him steadily. But I will tell you what I need. He waited. My grandmother is 73 years old, Juah said. She cooked her entire life. She built something extraordinary, and it was taken from her without her knowledge or her consent, and it made other people famous and wealthy and celebrated while she remained invisible. Juah kept her voice level. She does not need money, though money is part of what is owed. What she needs is for the record to be corrected, for her name to exist in the history of what Chongwon built, for the culinary world to know that a woman in Barnga, Liberia, was at the foundation of this empire. Not as a footnote, not as a source, as the origin. Park Sung-jin looked at the table. His hands had tightened slightly on his thighs. And if I refuse? He said. Not a threat, genuinely asking. Then I take everything in this bag to 3 separate journalists, a culinary historian I have already been in contact with, and a lawyer specializing in intellectual property. She said it without heat. But I don't think you're going to refuse, because I think you are not your father. And I think you have spent your career trying to build something you could be proud of. She paused. This is your opportunity to actually do that. Park Sung-jin did not answer her that Friday. He asked for time. Not in the way his representative had asked for things. Not as a delay tactic, not as a negotiation move. He asked for it the way a person asks for time when they have just been handed something too large to process standing up and they need to sit with it in private before they can speak honestly. Juah recognized the difference. She had felt that kind of weight herself, on the floor of her apartment surrounded by 41 books. The night she understood what had been taken. She gave him a week. She walked out of the building in Houndy and stood on the street in the late afternoon light with the bag over her shoulder and the Busan Sea somewhere behind the buildings, and she breathed. Just breathed. The meeting had gone exactly as she had prepared for it, and still she felt the cost of it in her body. The sustained effort of sitting across from a man with everything she had found and delivering it without flinching, without letting the anger she carried become a weapon she used carelessly. She had been careful. She needed to stay careful. She walked to the sea. It took her 20 minutes on foot, cutting through the streets below Houndy Beach until the city opened up and the water appeared. Gray and wide and indifferent in the way large bodies of water are always indifferent, which she had always found more comforting than people expected. The sea did not care about Chongwon, did not care about Master Han or Park Jin-ho or the long chain of choices and silences that had led a Liberian woman to a Busan sidewalk holding 11 pages of encoded truth. It was simply there. It had been there before all of it and would be there after. Juah stood at the edge of the water and let the wind come at her and thought about Mama Fatu. She thought about what her grandmother had said on the phone. Not the words exactly, but the quality underneath them. The long silence before she confirmed the visit. The sound she had made at the end that was older than a laugh. 37 years of knowing something had passed between her and two men in her kitchen that was not equal, without ever having the proof to name it clearly. 37 years of cooking in the same tradition, the same techniques, the same pepper paste that had built an empire she had never heard of. She would hear of it now. Juah had already decided that regardless of what Park Sung-jin chose, Mama Fatu would know, not as a burden, as a restoration. The truth belonged to her grandmother before it belonged to anyone else. Juah had only been the one to find it. She stayed at the water for a long time. Then she went home. The week passed slowly. She worked her shifts at Gwon's restaurant and came home and did not open the books. They were still stacked against the wall, 41 of them, but she was finished with them now. She had taken everything they contained. What remained was Master Han's, his handwriting, his decades of real cooking knowledge beneath the encoded confession, the irreplaceable body of work that existed alongside his wrongdoing and could not be separated from it. She had thought about this carefully. She did not want to reduce him to the worst thing he had done. He was also the man who had stood behind her at her station and said, "Keep going." Both of those things were true, and she was tired of the part of grief that wanted to make people simple. On the 5th day, she called the culinary historian. Her name was Dr. Shin Hyaji, a food culture researcher at a university in Seoul who had written extensively on the origins of Korean fine dining and who had, in one article Juah had found during her research, briefly noted that the early Chongwon menu showed unusual influences that had never been fully accounted for in the public record. It was a single sentence in a long academic paper, and it had been published 8 years ago and apparently gone nowhere. But it told Juah that Dr. Shin had already been looking at the edge of this question without knowing there was a door. She told Dr. Shin enough to establish that she had primary source documentation of significant historical relevance. Not everything. Enough. Dr. Shin's response was immediate and careful. The response of a scholar who had just been told that a question they had been sitting with for years might have an answer. "I would need to verify the documentation independently," Dr. Shin said. "Of course," Juah said. "That is exactly what should happen." They agreed to speak again after she had heard from Park Sung-jin. On the 6th day, she wrote a letter to Mama Fatu. Not a call, a letter, because some things deserved the weight of paper. She wrote it by hand, in the English they had always used between them, and she wrote it carefully and completely, from the night she opened the first book to the meeting in Houndy to the moment she stood at the edge of the sea. She did not soften anything. She wrote the whole truth, and she sealed it and addressed it and carried it to the post office herself. Park Sung-jin called on the 7th day. It was early morning, just past 7, and Juah was awake. She had been awake since 5, lying in the dark listening to the city find its feet, too alert to sleep and too tired to get up before the call came. She answered on the first ring. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. No preamble. No managed distance in his voice this time. "All week, I've been through my father's private papers. Things I had access to but never looked at carefully because I trusted what I had been told about the company's history." A pause. "I found corroborating records. Not the same documents you have, but enough." Juah sat up in the dark. "What does that mean for you?" she said. "It means I can't defend something I now know to be indefensible." His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort underneath it. "I've spent this week asking myself what kind of man I want to be about this. Whether I protect the institution or tell the truth." Another pause. "Those two things are not compatible. I think I've known that my whole career and chosen not to examine it too closely. And now I want to do what you asked." He exhaled slowly. "I want to correct the record. I want Fatu Kamara's name in the history of what we built. I want it properly documented, properly credited, publicly acknowledged. Not a press release managed by our communications team. Something real and verifiable and permanent." Juah was quiet for a moment. "There's also the matter of compensation. I know. I've spoken to our legal team confidentially, framed as a hypothetical. There are ways to structure a formal acknowledgement and financial settlement that are legally sound and don't require litigation. It would require your grandmother's participation and consent, and ideally legal representation on her behalf. She'll have it. I also want to say something that I don't expect to resolve anything." He stopped. Then, "I am sorry. Not on behalf of Chong-won. Personally. I know that doesn't reach back far enough to matter to your grandmother. But I needed to say it to you directly." Juah looked at the dark ceiling of her apartment. She thought about what sorry cost a man who had just dismantled something foundational about the story he told himself, and she thought about what it was worth, and she decided it was worth something. Not everything. Something. "I hear you," she said. It was the most honest response she had. "There's one more thing," Park Sung-jin said, "and you can tell me if this is overstepping." A pause. "Master Han's recipe books. The real content, not the encoding. His actual culinary work. It is extraordinary. I had people review portions of it, again hypothetically framed, and what he built over 40 years is a significant body of knowledge. If you are willing, I would like to fund the proper archiving and publication of his culinary legacy. With full credit. With the Liberian origins of the foundational techniques documented clearly and prominently." Juah was quiet for a long moment. "That would have to be structured carefully," she said finally. "The documentation of the origins cannot be a footnote. It has to be central." "Agreed. And my grandmother has final approval on how her techniques are described and attributed." "Agreed. And I want Dr. Shin Hyaji involved as the lead academic voice on the historical documentation." A brief pause. "I don't know her work, but I'll look at it. If her credentials support it." "Agreed." Juah breathed in slowly. Outside her window, the city was fully awake now. The morning traffic, the first delivery bikes, the overlapping sounds of a port city starting its day. She had listened to this city from this window for months as it went on without her. As she sat on the floor decoding a dead man's confession while her own life held still around her. It did not feel still anymore. "All right," she said. "Let's begin." The first meeting with Dr. Shin happened 3 weeks later, in Juah's apartment. The historian was a small, precise woman in her 50s who looked at the 41 books stacked against the wall and then at Juah and then back at the books with the expression of someone who has just seen something they will spend the rest of their career thinking about. "May I?" she said, reaching toward the stack. "Please." Dr. Shin pulled out Fermentation Studies, Volume I, and opened it and read the first page in silence. Then she looked up. "How long did it take you to decode the full system?" 7 weeks. "How did you know to look?" Juah thought about the night, the lamp buzzing, the cold tea, the single measurement that didn't add up in the work of a man who did not make mistakes. "One wrong number," she said. "In 40 years of perfect records." That was enough. Dr. Shin looked at her for a long moment. "He chose well," she said simply. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Juah walking the historian through the decoding system step by step. the same way she had once been walked through recipes she did not yet know, with patience and precision and the understanding that the knowledge was only useful if it was transferred completely. By the time Dr. Shin left, past 10 at night with photographs of every page of every relevant book on her camera and a notebook filled in her own precise handwriting, the shape of what would come next was visible. It would take time. The formal acknowledgement, the settlement, the archiving project. None of it would happen quickly. These things moved at the speed of institutions and lawyers and the particular care required when a truth is large enough to restructure a legacy. But it was moving. That was what mattered. After 37 years of standing still, it was finally moving. Mama Fatu called 2 weeks after the letter arrived. Juah knew from the first sound of her grandmother's breathing that she had read it more than once. There was a quality to her silence at the start of the call. Not the long, careful silence of the first call, but something different, fuller, like a room that has been empty for a long time and has just had its windows opened. "You found all of this in recipe books?" Mama Fatu said. "Yes. This Korean man. He hid it all inside recipe books." "Yes." A long pause. "He was ashamed," her grandmother said. Not a question. Not even quite a judgment, more like a reading. The way Mama Fatu had always read situations, with the directness of someone who had seen enough of the world to call things by their actual names. "I think so," Juah said. "I think he was ashamed and afraid and he didn't know how to fix it while he was alive, so he left it to someone else to carry. He left it to me." The sound her grandmother made when she was thinking. "And this young man, the son, he is going to do the right thing. He is trying to. Trying. Another that is different from doing. I know. I'm watching him." A pause. Then Mama Fatu said something that surprised her. Not the words but the lightness in them. A quality Juah had not heard from her grandmother in years. Something that belonged to an earlier version of her before age and loss had layered themselves over it. "You know what I remember most about those two men?" she said. "What?" "The one who watched. The thin one with the notebook. He ate 3 bowls of the pepper soup." A small sound that was close to a laugh. 3 bowls. He tried to pretend he was not enjoying it that much. "But I saw him." A pause. "I always knew that soup was extraordinary." Juah laughed. It came out of her before she could shape it. Sudden and real and slightly wet at the edges. "It is, Mama Fatu. It is the most extraordinary thing I have ever tasted." "I know," her grandmother said, with the complete absence of false modesty that Juah had always loved about her. "I made it." The formal acknowledgement was published 6 months later. Dr. Shin led the historical documentation, co-authored with 2 other food culture scholars, and reviewed by a Liberian cultural heritage researcher whose involvement Park Sung-jin had accepted without argument. It was published in 2 academic journals and simultaneously as a public-facing piece in a major Korean food magazine. Not buried in a quarterly supplement but on the cover, with a photograph that Juah had suggested and that the magazine had accepted. The photograph was of Mama Fatu's hands. Just her hands working mid-motion in the process of making the pepper paste in her kitchen in Monrovia. Her granddaughter had arranged the photograph through a Liberian photographer she had found and briefed with great care. The caption beneath the photograph read, "The hands that built an empire's foundation. Fatu Kamara, Barnga, Liberia. The culinary origin of Chongwon's founding menu." The financial settlement was handled privately, as these things must be. Juah was not at liberty to discuss the figure. What she could say was that Mama Fatu had received it with the same direct calm with which she received most things. Looked at the number, was quiet for a moment, and said that she supposed it would allow her to renovate her kitchen properly, which she had been meaning to do for 15 years. Juah had laughed for a long time at that. The archiving of Master Han's recipe books began the following spring. Juah was involved in the process from the beginning, not as a culinary consultant, though she was that too, but as the person who understood the books most completely. She worked alongside Dr. Shin and a small team of food scholars and a publisher who had committed to producing a 2-volume edition of Master Han's culinary work, properly contextualized, with the Liberian origins of the foundational techniques documented in full at the beginning of the first volume rather than in an appendix at the end. She had insisted on that. The beginning, not the end. Working with the books again was different from those 7 weeks on her apartment floor. The urgency was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was the work itself, the extraordinary, meticulous, lifelong accumulation of a man who had been genuinely great at the thing he had also done wrong. She held both of those truths every day, and she had stopped trying to resolve the tension between them. Some things did not resolve. Some things you simply carried more honestly as you understood them better. She was cooking again. Not in a restaurant. Not yet, though she had begun to think about it in the way you begin to think about something you are not ready to name but cannot stop returning to. For now she cooked in Gwon's kitchen in the evenings after her shift, using the extra hour he had begun quietly leaving available for her, never discussing it directly, which was his way of being generous without making it a thing. She cooked what she knew: the pepper doenjang braise, the palm oil reductions, the fermentation work she had been developing before the restaurant collapsed, which she was now building back from the ground up with the knowledge she had gained from 7 weeks inside Master Han's private mind. The two traditions, her grandmother's Liberian foundation and Master Han's Korean precision, sitting in her hands simultaneously, neither erasing the other, each making the other more complete. She thought sometimes about what it meant that she was the one who had inherited both. The granddaughter of the woman whose knowledge had been taken and the student of the man who had taken it. Placed at the intersection not by accident but by the specific, deliberate choice of a man who had been ashamed enough to leave a confession and wise enough to know who could read it. She did not forgive Master Han easily. She was not sure forgiveness was the right word for what she was working toward. What she was working toward was something more complicated and more honest. An accounting that held his greatness and his wrongdoing in the same frame without letting either disappear. That felt more true to what he had actually been than either condemnation or forgiveness alone. The recipe books would carry both. The world would be able to read him completely, finally, and decide for themselves what to do with the whole of him. On a Thursday evening in late spring, Juah stood at a prep station in Gwon's kitchen after closing and made her grandmother's pepper paste from memory. She had not attempted it since she was a child, watching Mama Fatu's hands move through the process in the kitchen in Monrovia. The measurements lived in her body rather than her head, the weight of pepper against palm, the temperature of the oil by how it moved, the particular smell that told you the fermentation had reached the right point before any instrument could confirm it. She worked through it slowly. The kitchen was empty and quiet around her. The only sounds the soft percussion of her own preparation and the distant noise of the street outside. She did not hurry. When it was finished, she stood looking at it for a moment. Then she tasted it. It was not exactly what she remembered. It was close, very close, but it had something her childhood memory of it did not have. Something that was hers, that had come from her own hands and her own years and the particular accumulation of her own journey. It was Mama Fatu's recipe, and it was also, undeniably, Juah's cooking. She thought that was exactly right. She covered the paste and wrote a label for it and put it in the cold. Then she cleaned her station, turned off the lights, and walked out into the Busan night. The city was alive around her, warm and loud and indifferent in the way cities are indifferent, which she had stopped minding. She had a long walk home. She took it slowly, through streets she had learned to read over years of moving through them alone, past the convenience store and the post office and the building with the broken elevator that had been repaired at last, past all the small landmarks of a life that had been stripped back to almost nothing and was quietly, stubbornly, building itself back up. She thought about Mama Fatu's kitchen in Monrovia. She thought about Master Han's handwriting, small and precise and slightly right-leaning, filling 41 books with everything he knew and everything he owed. She thought about Park Sung-jin in a quiet room in Haeundae, sitting with the weight of an inheritance he had not chosen and choosing, finally, to carry it honestly. She thought about one wrong number in 40 years of perfect records. She thought about what it meant to pay attention. She walked home through the Busan night and she was not finished. She was not close to finished, but for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she felt like the ground under her feet was hers. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to Afrokorean Storyhouse channel. More Afro-Korean cinematic stories are coming, and you don't want to miss a single one. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment that hit you hardest? We read every single one.